This is the first video in my macroeconomic series, and it's about the measurement of macroeconomic performance, which is part of the National Economy module of Economics AS level with AQA. The most important thing you'll learn for macroeconomics is the difference between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand is the total demand within the economy, which includes consumption, which is general spending by people on things such as food, cars, toys, anything really. Investment, which is money that businesses set aside and then they use it and they invest in something. And investing is when you put money into an item which you hope will later give you a greater return. For example, a business might invest in a machine which it believes will increase its productivity and thus allow it to make a greater profit in the future. There's government spending, which is any spending by the government on education, healthcare, benefits, stuff like that. And then we have the total net exports, which means exports minus imports. And we know this as the identity C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Aggregate supply is the total value of all the goods and services supplied in the economy. When we were doing microeconomics, we might just look at the supply of one item like cars or pens, but now we're looking at everything, so cars and pens and magazines and newspapers and machines and absolutely everything that's supplied within the economy. The interaction of these two forces produces a macroeconomic equilibrium, and in a later video we're going to look at drawing diagrams for this and displaying this. The main way that we measure macroeconomic success, at least at AS level, is through these four factors: economic growth, full employment, price stability and balance of trade. We're going to look over them in lots of different lights, lots of different views throughout this Unit 2 course, but for now I'm just going to tell you the ideals of each. So economic growth. Ideally, our capacity to produce goods and services will grow over time. Ideally, we'll have full employment and an efficient economy in which all our resources are used. Obviously, if we've got a few people that are unemployed, that's a resource that's lost forever because we can never gain back this time that we lost when they weren't working. Price stability. Ideally, we'll have control over our prices and relatively low inflation, target of 2%, because obviously when inflation rises, there's so many costs to this. We're going to come on to that later. Then we have the balance of trade, and hopefully our exports will be greater than or equal to our imports, as otherwise we'll be losing money to other countries, which isn't really very good. Economic indicators. When you receive your paper in the context, the first source in each context tends to be some economic statistics, and these are essentially economic indicators. They provide information about the expansions and contraction of business cycles, the current state of the economy. For example, it might tell you about employment, inflation, growth, stuff like that. And also from this you can work out the economy's likely future direction, so you'll have predicted statistics for the future. The reliability of these is often called into question, but we don't need to know too much about that at AS level. We're now going to look at all of those four indicators of economic success in more detail. The first one was economic growth. Economic growth is the capacity of the economy to produce more goods and services over time. There are two major ways to measure economic growth. The first one is gross domestic product, often abbreviated to GDP. This is the total value of goods and services produced in the economy in a year. There's two big types of GDP, nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP has not been adjusted for inflation, whilst real GDP has been adjusted for inflation. We'll come on to that in a second. Whenever you see the word real, it's to do with inflation being taken into account or not being taken into account. That's really important, because definitions for your question 1 on your context is quite often containing words like real, and if you don't know what it means, it might be a shock to you. So if you see real, it means inflation has been taken into account. Gross national product, abbreviated to GNP, is pretty similar to GDP, but it also includes net income from foreign investment. This could be money that's earned by UK residents working abroad. For example, if I had a husband called Paolo and he worked in France and he earned £20 and he sent it back to me, that would be some net income from a foreign investment which would count towards our GDP. Then another example of foreign investment is UK residents who own shares in a foreign firm. If they get money from their shares, that is net income from a foreign investment. So this is how to measure economic growth. To measure economic growth, you calculate the percentage change in GDP from year 1 to year 2. GDP is the total value of all goods and services in a country. So for the percentage change, you do the change in the GDP divided by the original GDP, and this will give you your nominal GDP. An example for this might be 4%. Say inflation was 2%, you'd take off 2% to get your real GDP growth. So your real GDP would be 4% minus 2%, which is 2%. And that's the real GDP because it's taking inflation into account, because obviously prices are rising with inflation every year, so it's really important to make sure this is taken into account so we don't get a false idea of how well the economy is doing. When comparing GDPs between countries, it's a good idea to get GDP per capita. This gives you a more realistic idea of the wealth of each individual citizen, though obviously there could be quite a variation between the spread of wealth in various countries. To calculate the GDP per capita, it's very simple. You get the GDP figure and the latest population figure, and you divide the GDP by the population. Economic growth cycles, this is a really important thing to learn, and it's really important to be able to tell when there's a positive output gap and a negative output gap, and be able to talk about it in great detail. In the future, you'll be able to label a positive and negative output gap on a long-run aggregate supply diagram, but you don't need to know that just yet. A negative output gap is when the economy is producing at less than its trend output. This means that GDP is below its productive potential. This usually means there's low output and quite high unemployment, because you don't need people to work when you're not making very much. This is quite often described as a recession, and when it's really serious, we call it a slump. The government during this period will tend to try to increase aggregate demand. This is because a stimulation of aggregate demand causes there to be a positive multiplier effect, where an increase in demand leads there to be an increased need for employment, so more people get employed, leading to a positive, like an upward spiral of demand and employment, which is really good for the economy, leads to a greater output and more efficiency. A positive output gap occurs when GDP exceeds trend GDP. It means it's above its productive potential. This is usually described as recovery, but when it's really big, it's described as a boom. Although this leads to increased employment, increased aggregate demand, increased output and stuff like that, there can be some issues of having a positive output gap. These issues occur when aggregate demand actually exceeds aggregate supply, so prices rise. This means that a positive output gap leads to increased inflationary pressure, and for a load of reasons, inflation really isn't good. A big one for that is that it decreases the competitiveness of the economy's goods. Because obviously if we've got inflation, our goods are going to be more expensive than the goods of countries from abroad, so we find it much harder to compete on the international market. This could lead to an increased balance of trade deficit, which really isn't good. Employment is when labour is actively exchanged in a productive activity, and this is usually in exchange for payments like wages. It's really good for an economy to have employment, because obviously it means that all of its workforce is being productive, so we're reaching our productive potential. However, we always want a bit of leeway with employment, so we want a few people that are unemployed so they can quickly move into new jobs. Unemployment isn't so good. This is when people don't have jobs and are seeking work at current wage rates. And this means that we've got wasted output that can be never recovered. Say I'm here, I'm unemployed, I'm really wanting a job, can't find one. I'm not that useful anyway, but say I was really useful, you'd be losing me, the economy would be losing me as a resource, and this time of maybe a year I've been unemployed, you can never recover the work I'd have done during that year. Unemployment has cost to so many people, the individual, the family of the individual, the area, and the government. An unemployed individual tends to suffer from a fall in confidence. This could lead to a whole range of things, such as alcoholism, depression, and a family breakdown. Obviously, these don't happen to every single unemployed person, but it's quite a common trait amongst unemployed people to fall into one of these traps. This could lead to a high social services expenditure, because we have to support these people that are going through these tough times. The family of the unemployed also suffers, both materialistically and emotionally. Materialistically they suffer because their employed family member has a lower income, and thus the purchases that the family previously took for granted are now, alas, unaffordable, meaning there's a reduced standard of living for the whole family. In terms of emotions, obviously living with someone that's unemployed, who may be slightly worried about their situation, is quite a distressing time for the whole family, so that's why people suffer emotionally when there's unemployment. In terms of the area, the whole area will suffer due to a negative multiplier effect. If there's a few unemployed people, they'll demand less, so therefore more people will be made unemployed. Shops might close even further, so more and more negative multiplier effect. If shops close, people might start moving away from the area. It'll lead to a massive downturn in the area. When you've got a lot of unemployed people, that leads to crime, and that's high police cost. It's just not really good for the area at all. And finally, the government suffers because not only does it suffer because obviously people think that's a bad government if they've got low employment, but it also suffers because previously they would have lots of income tax. They get loads of money from income tax, but if there's less people that are employed, they'll obviously be getting in less income tax, and they'll have to pay out more benefits. So that's really bad. So that leads to a budget deficit. There's a direct correlation between growth and employment. Obviously, when there's a rapid growth, there's lots of employment because people require workers to do their work for them to provide the increased output. But if growth is too fast and it leads to lots of research and development of new ideas, this could lead to new technology being created, which would lead to technological unemployment. Then we have growth which comes from immigrant workers, because when people see there's growth, not only does it come from immigrant workers, but also causes immigrant workers to come, because immigrant workers see that there's a growing place, they think, I'm going to go there, get a job. And some people think, this is really bad, but actually, this leads to a reduction in supply constraints, because immigrant workers provide the additional labour for firms, because there's no limit on the amount of labour firms can get, because they can always get more labour from these immigrants. Inflation is a persistent rise in general prices over time, so the price is going up and up and up. In 1 year, the price of a pen might have been 50p, the next year it's £1, the next year it's £2. This is really bad because the price is going up and up and up. This is inflation. Obviously, if we've got high inflation, that's not really good for the UK economy because we can't compete on the international level because our prices are so much higher than our competitors. Inflation also indicates the success of government policies to control the price rises, because obviously if there isn't much inflation, the government policies to control prices and make sure they don't spiral out of control have been quite successful. If we have really high inflation, it means that the government has either decided to tackle another problem, such as unemployment, or it's tried to tackle inflation and simply totally failed. There are several costs of inflation to the economy. Rising prices means that there's reduced business confidence, they're less likely to invest, and one major thing that they would have invested in would be workers. If they're not investing, they won't invest in workers, there'll be less employment, more unemployment, and thus a negative multiplier effect leading to lower output. People that are on minimum wages suffer because their wages don't rise to keep up with inflation, so they see a massive fall in the real value of their wages, which means they can't afford a lot of things that they really need. It's quite bad for the economy in comparison on the international level when we've got inflation, because our prices are much higher than our competitors, so we get a trade deficit. We export less because people don't want our expensive things, and we import more because everything else looks really cheap to us. And the risk of hyperinflation, as seen in Germany quite a long time ago. Hyperinflation is really bad because it means that money basically becomes worthless, economies shut down, people lose their life spendings, it's really tragic. But, it doesn't really happen that often. Hopefully we've learnt from our mistakes. Those that do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Nice quote there. Forgotten who it's by, but suck on that. Earlier we spoke about positive output gaps. I think we might have mentioned the inflationary pressure. Here's a more big breakdown of the inflationary pressure and where it comes from. When actual growth is above trend growth, there's a shortage of labour because our labour is already in places and it's used to producing a certain amount, not this increased amount. So we've got our workers here. These workers are in much higher demand because all the firms want workers to keep up with the new increased output. So these workers are able to demand a higher pay because obviously workers are quite inelastic in terms of supply. This means that we get cost-push inflation and a wage price spiral. If people's wages go up, obviously firms have a much higher cost, which means that they have to pass this extra cost on to their consumers. Prices rise, consumers and workers demand more to be able to keep up with these wages, and it just goes horribly downhill in a wage price spiral. Lots and lots of inflation, very, very bad. Luckily, we have our trusty government to look to in times like this, and they target and manipulate inflation, try to keep it at roughly 2%, which allows some change for fluctuation in prices, but nothing too serious. This target is set by and met by, rhymes, the Bank of England, and the Bank of England manipulates AD, aggregate demand, to try to ensure that inflation doesn't occur too much. We'll come to this in much more detail later when we do the monetary policy and interest rate policy. We measure inflation using index numbers, which is a weighted average of a group of items compared to a given base value of 100. This basket of items, what we tend to call a basket of items, it contains things that phone just fell onto the floor, typical households might buy, like bananas or a football, and you can look at it throughout the years and you can see how much things have gone up in price. Weighting is commodities are given a weighting proportional to its importance in the general pattern of consumer spending. So for example, whilst a plant pot might have gone up in price by 50%, it's not bought that much, whilst pens may have only gone up by 10%, but everyone buys pens. I mean, pens are the thing. I keep mentioning pens because I've got loads of pens on my table right in front of me. So pens will be given a much higher weighting even, than plant pots. In terms of calculating the inflation, the indication of inflation, we have two major figures, the retail price index and the consumer price index. The retail price index, often known as RPI, is the main domestic measure of inflation in the UK. This one is the one that takes into account the basket of goods, and it is currently 650 products in the basket of goods. This uses the weighted price index and gives a breakdown for particular products and services, so you might have got different things like food, sport, leisure, I'm not sure what other things you might have, but that sort of thing, and it's calculated by the Office of National Statistics. You probably don't need to know that, but it's just a nice fact for you. Then we have the Consumer Price Index, which is pretty much like the RPI, but it doesn't include changes in house prices in related areas. The reasons that we have this for a measure is so we can compare ourselves with Europe. We're known as the nation of homeowners. Europe, they tend to rent a bit more, so obviously it's quite important when house prices are rising so dramatically and fluctuating so much. We don't want this to affect our overall inflation rate. That's why we use this when comparing with Europe. And it also assesses the price stability in the whole euro area and compares our inflation directly with that of EU countries. If you ever have to write an essay and you're using the CPI in your essay because you've been given it as a bit of data, a bit of figures, you might want to comment on the reliability of this and how accurate it actually is, because it doesn't include, obviously, house prices, so it shows inflation as being much less serious than it might actually be. International competitiveness. Exports and imports, it is so important to get these the right way around and know what they are. Otherwise, I mean, you could lose 25 marks just straight away like that if you don't get these the right way around. Exports go out, imports come in. Export is the sale of goods or services to foreign countries, which is great for us because it generates income for us. Imports are in red because they're bad. They're the purchase of goods or services from abroad, which causes expenditure from the home country, so money rushes out. I mean, obviously they're not actually that bad because we get loads of variety of goods and services, luxury products we won't be able to make in our own country, but for the sake of money going in and out, not good for the UK economy. If we import more than we export, that leads to a balance of trade deficit. If we export more than we import, that leads to a balance of trade surplus. There are two big factors that affect our international competitiveness. One of them, as we've already discussed, is high inflation, which means that exports are too expensive in the overseas market and are thus less competitive. Our other one is our inefficient factors of production. So we've got some workers that are really not pulling their weight, pretty slow. That means that there's lower productivity and thus higher costs of production and therefore higher prices, and these are less competitive. A really high cost of production for countries like us with a minimum wage is wages. We can never compete with China in terms of costs and prices because they've got their workers working for not very much. Our workers are working for at least £5, £6 an hour. It's simply not possible for us to compete in terms of price. That's why we have to work on quality. Here are some problems that result from low international competitiveness. If we're unable to sell abroad, there's less demand for our products, and thus less demand for labour within the UK, leading to increased unemployment because people can't find work. This leads to a negative multiplier effect as demand falls, and this pulls us into a horrible negative output gap. I always get really sarcastic about really serious things, sorry. Luckily, we're moving on to happier things, the benefits resulting from high international competitiveness. We have an increased demand for abroad, so we need to supply more, and thus we have an increased demand for labour within the UK. We employ more people, woohoo! This means that we have more people employed, positive multiplier effect, more demand in the economy, increased output, and thus an increased positive output gap. Yes! That is the end of our first macroeconomics video. Obviously things got quite exciting towards the end. Hopefully they'll retain this excitement as the course goes on. I'll see you next time where we're going to get to look at exciting things such as the circular flow of income. Yay! Hope this video has helped you in some way and have a lovely day. Bye!